There are two different scheduling formats being discussed at the SEC annual meetings in Destin. And good news, they both benefit the Auburn Tigers.
Well, Zach, I actually just finished crushing some chicken farm, and I am freaking ready to rock and roll.
You are Locked On Auburn, your daily podcast on the Auburn Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, welcome on into Locked On Auburn, your daily Auburn Tigers podcast. I'm your host, Zac Blackerby, and thank you so much for making Locked On Auburn your first listen every single day. Before we jump into scheduling talk, in our second segment, we will talk about another publication that is labeled Auburn to finish last in the SEC West. We share our thoughts on that. And also in the third segment today, we are joined by the Locked On Magic host to talk about their thoughts on landing Jabari Smith potentially in this month's NBA draft. We're joined by Lance Dawe, Auburn Daily editor and host of Locked On Wildcats. And man, the meetings down in Destin, right? There was a lot of talk going into it about the whole Jimbo Fisher versus Nick Saban thing. People even pulled up the seating chart, which I think was a tad ridiculous, but I ate up every second of it and analyzed the heck out of it. But Lance, the big thing that matters the most from this is the scheduling. And there's two proposed options. None of them have to do with pods, but everybody does agree on one thing, that teams need to play each other more often, which I think is great. And then you hosting Kentucky, covering an SEC East team and also an SEC West team, they hardly ever overlap in football. So I think that's an interesting angle, and I think it's good. But I think whether it's the 1+7, where an SEC team keeps one protected rival and then you rotate the 7, or the 3-6, where you keep 3 protected rivals and you rotate 6. I think that is, I think they both, with the 3-6, it'll probably be Bama, Georgia, and my gut says LSU. But regardless, with everything rotating after that, even though that's extremely tough, your year in and year out schedule, I think, is easier from year to year from what it typically is.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you look at the 6 other schools that you'd have to play in your conference slate, and things would probably balance out. I mean, like you were saying, getting to play some teams from the SEC East as opposed to having to go through the SEC West gauntlet every single year the way that we have been, I think it's going to be beneficial for Auburn to maybe catch a Vanderbilt every other year, catch a Missouri, catch a Kentucky. You know, I definitely think that Auburn would like their chances against a team like that, as opposed to having to go on the road to Ole Miss, Arkansas, Texas A&M. I definitely think Auburn would benefit from that. I think that another way that you could look at this as potentially being a negative thing, and I talked about this recently on Locked On Kentucky, is having that extra conference game could potentially damage a team's ability to get to bowl eligibility. So you look and you have 3 non-conference games, right? If we switch to the 9-game SEC slate, you then have to find 3 more wins in non-conference play instead of 2. And you may say, well, that's not that difficult to do. Well, you look at the SEC West. I mean, honestly, right now, with the way things are shaping up, if you're sitting here as Auburn, how do you look at the rest of what's going on in the division and say, I'm comfortable picking out 3 wins instead of 2? I mean, you've got Arkansas on the rise. You've got Ole Miss on the rise. Mississippi State is always going to do something weird, and Auburn got to see that firsthand last season. So, I mean, getting to bowl eligibility now, if we do have the 3-6 model, which I think is what the SEC would lean towards, it's what I'm personally leaning towards. So that may just be my bias creeping into this argument.
Well, and Kentucky's AD spoke out in favor of the 3-6. And it sounds like, according to his comments, that the schools that were going into the meetings feeling like 1-7 was the way to go are now shifting more towards the 3-6. And I don't know. I don't think I care either way. I'm for more SEC games as a whole, so I guess I am for the 3-6. I think regardless, Auburn's going to be in a better spot, and I think most teams in the SEC West are going to be in a better spot because instead of playing Ole Miss one year, you may play South Carolina, which is weird from an Auburn perspective because the last 2 years South Carolina's whooped us or found a way to win. But instead of an Ole Miss, you may get a South Carolina. Instead of an Arkansas, you may get a Missouri. Instead of an LSU, if that's not a protected opponent for Auburn, you may get a Vanderbilt. And all of those are drastically different. And sure, you may get a Florida, depending on, if Florida's up or down on the year. But I think it's a good situation. And in the 3-6, you get to keep all of the folks that really value rivalries happy. And so it seems like a win-win situation.
Right. And that's why I'm in favor of the 3-6 as opposed to the 1-7, is because Auburn has more than one rivalry that I personally would like to see continue. I mean, obviously, if we're in the 1-7, Auburn's protected opponent is going to be Alabama. But I still want to continue the Deep South's oldest rivalry with Georgia, and I would love to find a way to continue the rivalry with LSU. So I like the 3-6 model better than the 1-7. And then, like you said, getting to get that extra conference game against potentially a weaker opponent is beneficial. And I think something else to add on to this, I know that I said bowl eligibility may be an issue, but the positive side of having that extra conference game is revenue. Instead of having your team blow out a cupcake and not a lot of people coming to see it, you get an extra conference game that people are going to care about more and people are going to show up for. So that's an extra added revenue source for your team. I think getting to play a team like South Carolina over getting to play a team like Tulane is going to be more entertaining for the fan base as a whole. So there are a lot of different angles that you can look at this as a positive thing. And I know that there are a couple different ways that you could look at this negatively. Like from the Kentucky perspective, for me, there are a lot of reasons why this could be a bad idea for the Wildcats, being a mid-tier to beneath average team in the SEC any given years. But for Auburn, I definitely think it's a good thing.
Well, this kind of stinks for the teams like Kentucky, where their biggest rival is not in the SEC, because you're going to have to play 9 conference games in Louisville. Yep. Or, South Carolina, they're going to play 9 SEC games in Clemson. Georgia probably doesn't care, 9 SEC games in Georgia Tech. Florida, I mean, right now FSU is down, but it adds a different dynamic. I don't think there's any question about that.
And I definitely think that when you're looking at making changes with Texas and Oklahoma coming to the SEC, the SEC is not looking at this and saying, oh, we've got to find a way to protect Missouri. Oh, we've got to find a way to protect Kentucky. No, they're looking at the mid-tier to the cream of the crop and saying, how do we make sure these programs continue to thrive, because they're the moneymakers? These are the teams that are getting into the playoff. These are the teams that are making noise for the good of the conference as a whole. How do we preserve these teams while also not necessarily screwing over the others, right? And I think that the 3-6 is going to allow the SEC to do that, but I'm curious to see how they sort out the protected opponents, because one way or another, I think some fan bases are going to end up being upset.
Yeah, I mean, you can't make everybody happy, but I think the SEC has handled this really, really well, even including, Oklahoma and Texas coming in. They weren't able to attend the meetings. They weren't allowed because they're not technically in the conference yet. They still reached out to them, Texas and Oklahoma representation, before the week started to get their thoughts. And I think that could go a long way. All right. Another publication has predicted Auburn to finish last in the SEC West. Is that legitimate? Or is it ridiculous? We talk about that in just a moment right here on Locked On Auburn. Today's show is brought to you by betonline.net, your number one source for all of your betting stats and sports info. Look, you can bet on every single game of the NBA Finals, including the action that happened last night. Also, Major League Baseball is virtually every night. And also, starting later today, the College World Series is getting going with regional weekend happening. And, of course, the action happening at Plainsman Park. You can get involved in all of that at BetOnline. BetOnline is your continued source for all sports wagering information, including live betting, esports, and more. BetOnline, where the game starts. Lance, in one of the preseason magazines that I get every year, the Lindy Sports Edition, shout out to Tank Bigsby making the cover, they do their conference picks. And the way they have the SEC West stacking up is Alabama, Texas A&M, Arkansas, Ole Miss, LSU, Mississippi State, and then Auburn. And the way they have this table set up is good news, bad news, our call. So good news for Auburn is Brian Harsin survived rumor mill. Running back Tank Bigsby rejected the portal, which that's great. Glad he's still here. Bad news, quarterback Bo Nix left after team went into tailspin late last season. Team needs to find leadership. Little dramatic there, but I get where they're coming from. And then the R call, questions at quarterback and lack of overall talent likely spell a 500 season and more grumbling. What are your thoughts on those comments? And then also your thoughts on Auburn finishing last, being projected to finish last in the SEC West?
Well, I'll say this first. As a national publication, I think it's really difficult to get people on the ground to really touch base and see what exactly is going on within the program. So you see the bad news there and saying that they lack leadership. I think a lot of people around Auburn would tell you, based on the way this offseason has gone, I think Auburn is really starting to rally the troops and they're getting everybody heading in the right direction. So I'm not saying...
And I'm glad that you say that, because they have a full... If you get the one that's available in Alabama, they have like a feature on each of the Alabama teams. And the one in Auburn is this like awesome commentary from John Samuel Shenker and Nick Brahms. And it's like, I don't know. It sounds like there's plenty of leadership with those two guys.
Yeah, exactly. And you read through the rest of the magazine, whenever they discuss Auburn, outside of the part where they have to discuss the positives, where they literally say, we're discussing the positives, they are criticizing Auburn, or they are saying things that would indicate that they are projecting a really bad season for the Tigers. And I think that that's fair for different people to have different opinions and for different projections to be thrown out there. I would also like to point out the fact that Auburn returns a decent amount of production. Something that Lindsey says themselves is Auburn's actually pretty strong in the trenches this season in terms of experience and then in terms of production on the defensive side of the ball. So there's a lot of reasons to believe that Auburn shouldn't finish last in the SEC West, and we can get into those. But I like Lindy's. I consistently enjoy reading their magazines, but this is one of those predictions where it's a little bit of bias here. But I just don't see Auburn finishing last in the SEC. And you look one team above them, Mississippi State. Mississippi State, in my mind, is a lot like Georgia Tech whenever Paul Johnson was there. They're running a very weird style of offense that against some teams it works, and against some teams it really, really doesn't work. And they will have years where they win 9 or 10 games, and then they'll have years where they lose 9 or 10 games. And so I think Mississippi State is not going to consistently be going up and up and up and up with Mike Leach there. I think it's going to be a roller coaster. So do we project this year to kind of be something like it was last year, or maybe a little bit worse? That's kind of what I'm leaning towards with Mississippi State. And with Auburn, I'm leaning towards there being a climb, because we were consistent quarterback play away from winning 8 or 9 games last season if you get lucky. So I don't see this prediction.
Yeah, and I just think from top to bottom, we'll do a whole show on this in the coming weeks, but from top to bottom, I think this team is better than it was last year. And I know the bad news that Lindy's puts out is, Bo Nix leaving after a tough end of the season. But
is that bad?
I could see how it looks bad, but we all talked about it as soon as he entered the portal, and it was like, okay, the Brian Harsin era is starting now. But once again, the goalpost moved a few months later at the start of the offseason. So is it bad? I don't think any of these quarterbacks right now are better than Bo Nix, but I think it's a healthy kind of, I don't know. I think it's just a healthy situation that he's not the quarterback anymore.
Right. I'd like to think that somebody on this roster is going to consistently have a higher floor than what Auburn's had at quarterback over the past couple of years, but the ceiling is the question mark. So is it a bad thing? Like you said, I think it can be perceived as a negative thing, but exactly like you just said, I think Auburn is in a healthier place now than where they were a season ago.
I think so. But yeah, I mean, just for context here, and like their first bit of content in this magazine on page 6, after they do like the editor's letter and all that stuff, like their first bit, they've got a list of 5 coaches on the hot seat. And Brian Harsin's the second coach that they list after Nebraska's Scott Frost. And it's like, okay, it's going to be that kind of perception for Auburn in this publication, which isn't a surprise, but it would have been nice for, some out of the box thinking on this.
Yeah. And you look at their top 25 and they rank every single Division I team, and they've got Auburn 47th in the nation, 12th best team in the SEC, which I also don't see. And something that they mention in the little blurb on 5 hot coaches on the hot seat, they say, and Brian Harsin could have been the Mark Few of college football. It's like, that's still not out the window. It's 1 year, guys. It's 1 year. And so I understand the perception that Auburn, after 1 year, it's like, oh, well, they may not be in a great place with Brian Harsin, but it's going to be very difficult to fire a guy after 2 seasons.
Yeah.
You've got to be able to give him an opportunity to really do things. And the thing that a lot of different media members continue to come back to is like Nick Saban won 7 games in his first year with Alabama. If I'm not mistaken, he lost ULM. Things just take time.
Not the same thing because he had like a top 3 recruiting class coming in. So a little different, but yeah, different. There's different starting points for everybody for sure. Lance, we're about to jump into a conversation with the host from Locked On Magic, talk a little Jabari. But before we jump into that, how can people find you, hear you, listen to you, all that good stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. They can read what I'm writing over at auburndaily.com. Got a lot of great content coming out over there. They can also listen to the Locked On Kentucky podcast wherever they get their podcasts. That is Lance Dawe, our guest today. We'll talk Jabari Smith in just a moment, right here on Locked On Auburn. And joining us now here on Locked On Auburn, Locked On Magic host Philip Rossman Reich. Philip, it seems like there's a big 3 that is formed, right? Auburn's Jabari Smith, Paolo from Duke, and Holmgren from Gonzaga. Of course, I'm extremely biased. I think Jabari should be the guy for the Orlando Magic, but what are your thoughts? I mean, it's been a few weeks now since you guys won the lottery. Give us a lay of the land from your perspective.
Yeah, obviously it's sort of a unique draft. I mean, typically when you think about the NBA draft, there's usually like a clear-cut number 1 guy in the class. Whether it's Zion that 1 year, LeBron. It's very rare that you have 2, let alone 3 guys all in the running for the first pick. And typically you see NBA people begin to as the draft gets closer, it's like, okay, this is where the team is leaning. The Magic are going to keep everyone guessing. Let's make that clear. They do not leak anything. It's not going to be clear who the Magic are picking until Adam Silver goes up to the podium. But like you, I've been reading a lot of the NBA draft people. It seems like all the polling of executives, everyone seems to believe that the Magic are eventually going to pick Jabari Smith Jr. And honestly, that's where I'm leaning. More times than not. It's a very good group of 3 here at the top of the draft. I will admit that my pick tends to change daily, sometimes hourly, sometimes minutely. This last hour that we've been talking about Jabari Smith, I'm certainly on the Jabari train again. Yeah. But I have typically been leaning toward Jabari Smith Jr. as the pick at number 1 for the Orlando Magic. You guys know how good he is and how varied his skills are, and they're all skills that the Magic need, and he checks all the boxes for this team. So, with 23 days to go until the NBA draft, I think Jabari Smith is the betting favorite.
Yeah, we were talking about this before we clicked record, Philip, but just looking at mock drafts right after the lottery, it seemed about 50-50 based on which one you read. About 50% had Orlando taking Jabari, about 50% had them taking Chet Holmgren from Gonzaga. But over the next few weeks, it's pretty much all been Jabari. I mean, do you think that's just because, maybe some of these riders are talking to Orlando front office people, or is it just kind of a lot of groupthink? I mean, what's causing this shift, do you think?
I think it's definitely groupthink. Let's just preface this here. The Orlando Magic do not leak anything. Like I'm in Orlando. I know people in that front office. They do not tell anyone anything. They value their privacy. They keep their cards close to the vest. So very rarely, everything that I've read are saying rival executives think, or executives around the league seem to expect this to happen. We're not going to really know till Adam Silver's up at the podium on June 23rd. But, Jabari Smith has been number 1 on a lot of people's boards for most of the season, probably from about, I would say, early January, maybe mid-January, all the way through the NCAA tournament. Sure. A lot of people had Jabari Smith as the number 1 player. And obviously, there hasn't been any games played since March for anyone outside some of the international guys. But I think people are kind of re-hardening and kind of after all the talk, after just kind of being a little bit bored, with their boards and trying to, maybe create a little something or reviewing tape to kind of say, oh, wait, maybe this guy is a little bit better than I thought. I think everyone's kind of coming back to their mean. Chuck Daly used to say, you're always trying to find your mean. Your mean. Water kind of goes up and down, and then it finds its level. I think we're starting to see everyone kind of find their level again, which was Jabari Smith is the best player in this draft. And everyone knows that he is a guy that the Magic like. The Magic tend to like defensive-minded wings. They tend to like long athletic wings. They tend to like guys who value the defensive end. They need some three-point shooting. They have a need at forward right now. It seems like everyone kind of understands that this is a guy that fits what the Magic are trying to do and trying to accomplish. And he's been the best player on a lot of people's boards for most of the season anyway.
Yeah. So Philip, you mentioned that as of right now, you're on the Jabari train. Do you say that from, okay, you think they're going to take Jabari, or do you think that is the best move for the Magic?
I would say both, to be perfectly honest. Like I said, Jabari checks a lot of boxes that Orlando likes. He has a lot of skills that Orlando needs. Maybe the only skill that I think there are some questions about are his ability to create his own shot and get to the basket on his own. Just kind of be that primary scorer. I will admit this. Please don't hate me.
No,
listeners, not to hate me. We did a mock draft literally right before the lottery. I picked Paolo Banchero because Paolo to me was the one guy among those top three who you could give the ball to. He can get you 20. He can get you a basket in a big spot. And we saw him do that at Duke. And so I took Paolo number one. I had Paolo number one on my board for a little bit, but I'm kind of starting to track that back as I watch a little bit more tape, as I learn a little bit more about Jabari Smith, as I kind of start doing my own background information. And certainly you've helped with that here too as well. And start to kind of dig into him a little bit more. Jabari, I think has just, to me, he's the safest pick. I've come to for my fans at least, come to compare him a lot to Rashard Lewis. Rashard Lewis was a two-time All-Star in the NBA. He was one of the original stretch fours, really revolutionized that position. A fantastic defender who could guard LeBron James as easily as he could guard Kevin Garnett. He could play out on the wing. He could play on the post. He destroyed smaller guards on the post. He was a knockdown three-point shooter. Again, revolutionized the position. And helped revolutionize the way the NBA is being played right now. I think at bare minimum, Jabari Smith is that. And so to say a guy is bare minimum, a two-time All-Star, a guy who is one of the best players in Magic franchise history, that's a pretty good place to start. And so, not that you should pick a guy because he's the safest pick. To me, Jabari not only has the highest floor, he also has one of the higher ceilings on this team because he's only going to get better. But if he's just what he was at Auburn, translated a little bit to the NBA, that's still a really, really good player.
Yeah. So this, if Jabari goes to play for the Orlando Magic, Philip, this would not be the first Auburn Tiger the Magic have taken in recent years. Obviously, they did not play together, but Kiki, just talking to you before we clicked record, Philip, it sounds like the Magic really like Chuma Okeke. Give us a status update on Chuma.
Yeah, Chuma is the guy. Everyone on the team just absolutely loves him. First and foremost, they just love Chuma the person. They think he's, whenever anyone asks a Magic player who is the funniest player on the team, and this is a bunch of young guys. I think they had 2 players older than 30 on the roster this year.
Wow.
In Terrence Ross and Robin Lopez, and Robin Lopez is a giant kid anyway. They would all uniformly say Chuma Okeke is the funniest guy on the team. Everybody on this team loves Chuma Okeke.
That's great.
A lot of fans are still getting to know his personality. I think Chuma is a little bit shy around new people and shy around media settings, especially. But everyone loves his game here too, and I think a lot of it is just trying to get the most out of Chuma. Obviously, he was early in his career. He's coming back from the torn ACL. I think this last year and a bit of this year was still him recovering from that injury. It takes a while to recover from an injury like that. And he's had so many little nagging injuries. It's been tough for him to find a rhythm, but every time he finds his rhythm, he becomes this knockdown three-point shooter. He's a guy that I think the Magic have a lot of confidence in to continue developing into a shooter. But more than anything else, he's already just a really lockdown defender. I think he's certainly in the top quarter of the league in steals per 75 possessions. He's a guy that gets into passing lanes. He's a really tough guy to score against. And again, it's just about, can he stay healthy? Can he find his rhythm? But he's a guy that gets deflections, makes defensive plays, does all the things coaches love to do. If he gets that shooting rhythm down, he is going to be a super valuable player for the Magic moving forward.
Hypothetically, in your mind, would Jabari and Chuma make sense playing next to each other on the floor?
Absolutely. And I think that's the ideal of what the Magic are going for. Maybe not that specific pairing, but players like that. The Magic are full of guys like Franz Wagner, who's a rookie from Michigan last year. He's 6'10", kind of rangy, athletic, can play the 3 or the 4. They have Jonathan Isaac still, coming back from a torn ACL himself. He's missed the last two seasons. He's a guy that just changes the game with his rim protection, his ability to guard on the perimeter as well as in the paint. Chuma Okeke's much of the same mold, and Jabari Smith is obviously of the same mold there too. So what the Magic are really trying to build with their forwards are guys who can play together. They want to be able to put any of those 4 guys together and be comfortable that, hey, we're covered on the wings. Defensively, our wings are covered. You're going to find it very difficult to score and get through all the arms that we have, kind of keeping you from the paint. And obviously, Chuma Okeke's already kind of established himself as a really good defender. And that's just a really good place from the start. So absolutely, there is, I would honestly say there is almost a 100% chance if the Magic draft Jabari Smith, you will see both on the floor together at some point. You might even see Chuma Okeke or Jabari Smith or one of them playing the 2 so they can have 3 of those 4 guys on the court. That's how much confidence I think they have in these guys defensively.
I love that. Philip, if this goes the way we think it's going to, a lot of the folks watching and listening right now will be hopping over to Locked On Magic. How can folks find that and find all of your work covering this team?
Yeah, the best play, obviously, Locked On Magic is a great place to go. We have a YouTube page. You can also find us wherever you download podcasts. Search for Locked On Magic wherever you download your podcasts. You can follow me on Twitter at PhilipRR_MD. And for my written work, you can find me at OrlandoMagicDaily.com. I'm a credentialed member of the media covering the Orlando Magic, so I'm at almost every press conference. I will certainly be at the introductory press conference on June 24th, way off into the future here in a couple of weeks. Sure. But I'll be doing more mock drafts. I think I had Jabari Smith first on my last mock draft from last week. We'll be doing player draft profiles. We'll be hitting everyone. We're trying to cover everyone around the draft, but certainly it's a big offseason. And if you don't have an NBA team attached, the Orlando Magic we're at the bottom floor here for the Orlando Magic, so it's a good time to get on.
Philip, thank you so much for your time, brother.
Appreciate it.
Thank you so much to our guest today. A lot of fun talking football, a lot of fun talking a little NBA draft, because us Auburn folks, we pay attention to that now. Very, very fun. Very, very exciting. Hey, and it is regional weekend on the Plains. Good luck to the Auburn baseball team. We'll recap all the action on Monday's show. Follow me on Twitter at Zac Blackerby. Read all of my written work at auburndaily.com and subscribe. This has been Locked On Auburn.